This entry into the history of financial futures is sponsored by Eurex.
Once people saw the success of what the Chicago markets, and I include the Merck in that as well, could do they wanted a piece of it. They wanted not just to participate, but they wanted to create it in their own countries, certainly in Europe and London and elsewhere in the world, Hong Kong. They were doing that on a regular basis, Singapore, other places that were financial centers around the world. But there is an art form to doing what the Board of Trade and the Merck had done for so many years and done so well, and they were slow learners. So when you point to market share, the Board of Trade's market share declined the whole time I was there. We were still the world's oldest and largest futures exchange, both when I joined and when I left. The market share declined, but that's because the market grew so much and there were so many more market participants. The Merck's market share was rising. New York, NYMEX, and COMEX, and the other exchanges around the world, their market share was rising as well. Their volumes were rising. And so I think it was a concept whereby everybody's ship was being floated higher, but they saw the benefits, and so you actually, for a period of time there, you had a number of competition elements that don't exist today. For example, I think today the CME trades 98% of the futures contracts traded in the United States. There was a time in the 80s where I believe there were 17 national exchanges just in the U.S., and that included people like the Kansas City Board of Trade, the COMEX, and others who were very successful within their niches. Perhaps in the next 20 years, we'll see new market entrants and we'll see growth of other exchanges in different areas, maybe cryptocurrency, wherever it may be. What always causes changes in the tax law is money. The federal government saw something that previously had been a very, very small part of the federal budget, trading in futures on wheat and corn or whatever. Now suddenly was a very major part of the economy in terms of trading treasury bonds and stock index futures and everything else. And somebody figured out that, well, there was money to be made here. If we did away with the advantages that had been given to professional traders for 100 years, we could make more money on a national basis. And of course, anytime you wave that flag in front of congressmen, you're going to get their attention, because any way you can reduce the national budget, you're going the national deficit. Any way you can benefit the national budget, you're going to do it. And so consequently, at first glance, a lot of people who didn't know the industry thought, oh my God, here's all these multimillionaires. Today they'd be called billionaires. And they're not paying their fair share of taxes. And they didn't understand the industry or how life as an individual trader, for example, as a market maker, how much you could be up one day and down the next, and how volatile their markets were. And if you were a position trader, having to hold a position through a tax year and all the other ramifications that came up. So there was an educational process that needed to be done. And again, that's where I think Tom Donovan and Leo Melamed linked arms and led the industry into Washington and did a wonderful job educating people as to what was really going on and what would be a good compromise. And it was difficult. But in the end, I think there is a compromise that's now existed for, 35 years? And I think it's been beneficial to our financial markets and the United States government both. One of the things that developed as futures themselves became more successful and grew in volume is you had what I would call fringe players who were skating very close to ethical and legal lines in terms of how they're marketing their products. And they went under a variety of different names in terms of the contracts they offered. But a small percentage of them were quite frankly fraudulent. And they reflected back on the futures markets in terms of how Washington viewed the industry and how people in general viewed the industry. So there was a constant, if you would, tension between the Board of Trade, the Merck, the CFTC, and Congress with respect to what should be the jurisdiction of the CFTC, what should they regulate and what should they not regulate. And when there are abuses in currency markets, there's a tendency to say, oh, we got to curb that. Let's give jurisdiction to the CFTC or whatever. But then you got to go talk to the Treasury. And the Treasury is sitting there going, wait a minute, 99.9% of the system's working very well, thank you. Don't interfere. And so those processes went on with a variety of markets through the 80s and through the 90s and to some extent today. And I think with the Dodd-Frank revolution, the CFTC in particular got more jurisdiction to deal with off-exchange matters. And so consequently, there was a push then all of a sudden for the CFTC to be regulating that. Obviously, the exchanges had no jurisdiction over people who were not members. And so that regulation aspect of the federal government, particularly since Dodd-Frank, has grown. But it's a very difficult one because you're getting some areas where people are skating on very thin jurisdictional lines from a legal basis, and they're quite legitimate. Hedge-to-arrive contracts, for example, in the agricultural world, where I considered a classic example. But at the same time, they can be subject to enormous abuse and fraud. So who's got the jurisdiction to deal with them? It's a difficult question. Well, of course, Phil Johnson was, before he was CFTC chairman, was the outside counsel for the Chicago Board of Trade. So he was somebody that we as an institution were very familiar with, and he was very familiar with us. And unlike a lot of Washington regulators, he was somebody who truly was from the industry. Even though he was a lawyer, not a trader, he understood the industry and he knew the industry. And it's unusual in Washington when you get people in positions of authority, particularly with appointed positions, who come from the industry. They're generally people who are more governmental in nature, and this is one stop on their way to something else and something better. So we were very fortunate as an industry to have Phil in that position at that time, and he was able to convince the necessary people, both in Congress and at the SEC, that futures were very different. They were not the same as the equity markets, and we would work together to share information and regulation and do what was necessary in that regard, but leave futures regulation to us and you maintain equities jurisdiction. Well, all of that stems back to a problem that's been inherent in the regulatory system from the get-go, which is, what is a futures contract? This is the legal equivalent of a philosophical question of the ages that's never been answered. You who are familiar with the animal say, I know it when I see it. It's a little bit like Justice Potter Stewart said about obscenity. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And a futures contract is very much the same thing. So you had the regulations under the CEA when it was administered out of the Department of Agriculture, but they were very vague in general. And when you're dealing with just agricultural products, it's relatively easy to pin what's a futures contract. But as you got into financials, you get this issue of cash settlement and other issues as well. And now you have to come back and look at that definition of what is a futures contract, because that's what takes it out of state regulation of gambling or any other state statute and puts it into the federal jurisdictional system and leaves you with just one system to deal with and one system to work with. And so over the years, and this goes back really to the beginning of the CFTC in 1975, defining that which is a futures contract has been an ongoing issue and has been an ongoing evolution. And Shad Johnson was a milestone in that regard because of cash settlement. But there are other issues as well that came up over the years. And I think that if you get down to the last 10 years, you've probably gotten a lot of definition and clarity legally with respect to all those features of what is a futures contract and what isn't. The numbers have changed enormously. I mean, when I was running the clearing corporation, we had over 150 members, and a significant portion of those, 30 or 40, were sole proprietor clearing members. That's a totally different culture than what you have today, where with 98% of the contracts traded through the CME clearinghouse, I think you have fewer than 50 clearing members. The difference is that you diversified risk when you have more clearing firms. You granted opportunity, again, to have a sole proprietor clearing firm created a whole different business opportunity for somebody as a market maker and as a proprietary trader than if you had to clear through a large bank or anybody else. So from the standpoint, though, of the exchange, the fewer clearing members you have and the more well capitalized they are, the easier your job is and the safer the market system is. So you have this tension going opposite directions. Do we want to encourage the spread of proprietary individual trading and other forms in our clearing structure and create more liquid markets that way, but admittedly requires more oversight because there's a slightly higher risk factor, no matter how you screen for clearing members? Or do we want to cut it back and have very few clearing members and breathe easier, so to speak, every day? But it's a very different place, and it's a hard entry now. The entry barrier is much greater when you have a clearinghouse with so few members and such high capitalization requirements. So it's a philosophical offset. Well, quite frankly, the tension was political. I mean, you had an established economic system in New York, on Wall Street, whatever you want to call it, in the securities industry. And suddenly you had, they used to refer to them, I think, as those cowboys in Chicago, coming in and becoming a part of their marketplace. They weren't part of the club. They weren't part of the system. And so the fear that the Chicago markets always had was, why subject ourselves to a regulator who's going to regard us as second-class citizens and on a substantive level doesn't really understand what we do? And so those were two very high-ranking concerns and objections to folding into one regulator. Having said that, over the years, as people became more educated about what futures were and they became more established, if you would, in the marketplace and accepted, a great many of us, and I was one of them, thought that we were headed towards a single regulator. Now, you would want that single regulator to be even-handed in terms of the regulation of the different products. You would want them to be well educated in both. But you could have merged the CFTC and the SEC by the 90s, for example, and if you did it right and you had the right people in charge, it could have been very successful. There's one big problem that people don't talk about, and that is that with separate jurisdictions, Congress had separate oversight committees, and still does to this day. And oversight over a substantial portion of the economy is an important thing to a congressman in the committee structure because that represents power, which is the lingua franca of Washington. Actually, the lingua franca is the appearance of power, but real power is real currency. And so now you suddenly had the congressional committees going, wait a minute, we're not going to give up our jurisdiction if you merge and go into one entity. So you added a third element, which was the political agenda, into the mainstream. And as a consequence, I despair of in my lifetime if it will happen. I think logically it should have happened by now, but I don't think it's going to. Early on, I think the relationship was quite good. I think that there were people who were overlapping constantly on a daily basis. As we started to trade options on futures, having experienced option traders was very useful because this was a very different kind of trading, even when you're putting options on futures. Somebody once likened it to the difference between checkers and three-dimensional chess, and I think that was probably a pretty good estimation. So early on, I think the relationship was very good. In the mid-'80s, we actually had a joint venture, and we spent many, many hours meeting with the leadership of the CBOE to try and establish joint contracts, et cetera. And we launched one, and then it didn't work. And I think from that point on, the relationship took different roads. And the CBOE grew. You started getting a different generation of traders coming in and having memberships. They had no idea of how the CBOE started. They had no allegiance to the Board of Trade. And I think it was kind of a natural, it's like a second generation parent-child relationship. There were those who maintained the relationship, but over time drifted apart. I would have liked to have seen the Board of Trade exercise more authority early on, instead of divorcing themselves completely from the CBOE because of the fear of the regulatory structure, which was the primary motivation. I would have liked to have thought that there were maybe some people, be it the O'Connor brothers or whoever, who were far-seeing enough that they could see the future potential of this and have retained it for the membership of the Board of Trade. But as it turned out very successfully for both parties.